Welcome everybody. I'm Mark Fox, CEO of NetEvents. Delighted you can join us today. So we have media from all around the globe here, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, North America, and also additional analysts in addition to Omdia. So chairing the session today on the distributed superfortress, securing tomorrow's IT infrastructure. We have Jeff Wilson, who's the Chief Analyst of Cybersecurity Technology at Omdia. And Jeff, I'd like to hand over to you to chair this session. So Jeff, over to you.
So, hey, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I know we have journalists from everywhere on the line. Welcome aboard. This is probably your, maybe 500th Zoom webinar you've done in the last year and change. So hopefully we'll keep things interesting for you here. We have a really fantastic panel and a really interesting set of topics. And mostly we want to hear from you. So make sure you're banking questions as we're throwing ideas out there and hit us with them later after we get through sort of the discussion topics. As you can see on the screen, we have a killer panel. I'm not going to go into great detail introducing everyone, but TK from Cisco, Gail from F5, Darren from NetScout, and Craig from VMware have a really broad range of understanding of the sort of cybersecurity landscape, and hopefully we will have a really interesting discussion. So if you want to scoot over to the next slide. So what are we talking about today? The meat of the discussion portion is going to focus on three topics: the lasting impacts of the pandemic on IT operations in general, and specifically on cybersecurity, and what a CISO needs to keep in mind as a result of the changes that happened last year, and really the first half of this year as well, because we're not out of it yet and it's June already. Sort of what the big picture landscape for mitigating the most advanced threats is post 2020, today and beyond, and then finally how the cloud and shifting architectures to the cloud sort of remakes this the landscape for identifying and stopping attacks and putting security controls in place in your infrastructure. So those are the three key topics, but I'm sure we'll get off of them. Hopefully that makes the discussion more interesting usually. So if you want to scoot over to the next slide. So what was happening before, if anyone can remember 2019, what were sort of the prime movers in the cybersecurity technology landscape prior to COVID? In my mind, there were four key intermingling drivers happening all at the same time. The first is IT transformation. This is really about the move of infrastructure from owned on-premise infrastructure into the wonderful, flexible, and hopefully cheaper cloud, right? Digital transformation, the digitization of everything and connecting everything to and through cloud services and infrastructure. Second, and always important, no matter what else is going on, is the evolution of the threats themselves. We don't live in a vacuum. There isn't a Ready Player One CPU waiting for us to make our next advancement in security before they launch new attacks. The attackers are constantly evolving threats. Sometimes regardless of infrastructure, and sometimes aimed specifically at changes in infrastructure. The third is most companies are going through a process of reconciliation and consolidation. Security infrastructure since the mid-90s, when it first became commercial product solutions, has been sort of one protection mechanism for one new attack, sort of kludgy mess that we've built. Very few organizations have had the opportunity to step back and say, what do I really need to protect my infrastructure? What are the key components or platforms? And how can I get a cohesive rollout of those key components and platforms with as few individual products and vendors as possible? Folks are reconciling. Fewer devices, fewer vendors, simpler operations in order to eliminate the number of seams between solutions. And then finally, part of this IT transformation is relocating infrastructure into the cloud, and the other part is connecting anything and everything with a heartbeat to networks. because that drives efficiency in business. And all four of these trends together sort of started moving folks in a particular direction. When it came to what was it that stopped people from making investments in security, the pretty typical when we surveyed enterprises, things like the high cost of solutions, lack of innovation among vendors, too much of doing the same thing the same way. As always, we have problems with standards-based solutions, which in our discussion of questions yesterday, creates an interesting opportunity for cloud and cloud infrastructure to become the standard IT operating platform to help with standardization a little bit, the complexity of security infrastructure. So what people weren't worried about and fretting over was, what happens if all of my workers go home tomorrow? And if you skip to the next slide, I won't belabor the point about sort of the pandemic and the stopping of things, but what we're seeing now after a year and a few months of dealing with life after global shelter-in-place orders and lockdowns and supply chain disruption and the political and social upheaval that came as a result, and the true loss of life, is that there is a real power in moving to a digital life. Companies who were more digital, more agile, more in the cloud, more flexible, had an easier time making the transition from life as we knew it in business before the pandemic to life after. And the key tenets of that digital life are: cloud is the center of IT. The borders are effectively gone. This is we've been in a process of receding borders for 20 years, but we whatever was left of the borders we pulled up, as a global business community in 2020. Network traffic exploded, right? If life becomes more digital, whether it's business or private, all that traffic has to go somewhere and come from somewhere. And when there is an explosion in traffic, there's an explosion in requirement for securing that traffic at all layers, whether that's cloud data centers, in the emerging edge, in whatever campuses and businesses are left, and then in metropolitan and residential networks. And as always, attackers have their eyes open and they adjusted strategy. And in this case, they very specifically took aim at some vulnerabilities that came as a result of the pandemic. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the discussion section, but the attackers are opportunistic. And as it turns out, a global pandemic creates a lot of new opportunities to attack. All right, so if we move to the next slide. And so the threats and the risks are changing. This is a little bit of a word salad here, but that's the idea. All of these things are meant to spark ideas about how it's possible that threats and risks might change. When you're a large bank in the US and you go from 50,000 concurrent remote users to 300,000 concurrent remote users in less than a month. When you take your high value executives, your CFO, your CEO, and you put them at home permanently, what kind of changes do you have to make in how you deploy security to those people? When you're setting up ad hoc networks to do things like testing in parking lots or vaccines in stadiums, carrying sensitive medical data. As more and more people move into the cloud, we start to see the cracks in cloud infrastructure. Where are the new vulnerabilities? And if we tie all these cloud thoughts together, the cloud providers are adding features at an unprecedented rate. And because the new architecture is all code, there's no real staging. It's not 6 months per release. It's add features as we develop them and figure out that they work. Cloud application vulnerability, supply chain attacks, the growing complexity of technology, again, always creating seams to slip through. Even non-technical issues like the skills shortage. Hackers take advantage of the fact that they know that most companies don't have enough people to do the work that needs to be done. And even the security vendor landscape is a little bit unstable. If you skip to the next slide, I was just doing some work on, a quarterly report that I do, sizing, some key markets in security, things like web security, mail security, CASB, advanced threat prevention. And if you look at the number of major security technology vendors that have gone under the ownership of private equity in the last 12 months, you can see that there's a big shakeup even in the vendor community. And then the last point that we'll talk about is cloud migration is inevitable and old security models are going to have to die. The beauty of migrating IT infrastructure into the cloud is that you can do everything fast. You can take advantage of pricing or feature sets in new cloud infrastructure as it makes sense because everything's portable and mobile. Unfortunately, that doesn't leave adequate time in the old model of security to develop and test mitigation or protection or even visibility infrastructure in the cloud. But speed and efficiency and connectivity always win. Very few organizations wait for security to be 100% sorted out before they deploy connectivity. Those organizations usually involve, government clearance and three-letter agencies. So the models for developing and deploying security in the cloud have to change, and we're going to talk about that in the Q&A. So last slide. And the vendor and technology landscape is going to change. As journalists, I know you're always sort of chasing the stories about threat events and what those mean, but also about technology developments in the vendors and what they're doing about it. And we come from a world of historically major focus in a lot of cases on networking and network security in the security landscape. I think firewall and endpoint security historically have been the largest markets and the two of the key sort of platform components. And those markets are served by traditional networking vendors, well-known network security vendors, and technology. Well, that's running headlong into the cloud. And as we move networks into the cloud, the influence of cloud-focused vendors rears its head in security. Cloud-focused security vendors, the cloud providers themselves, managed security providers, telcos, networking and security vendors all have a stake in the cloud. And as those two converge, what we end up with are the parallel trends of SASE, Secure Access Service Edge, which is about connecting everything in this new world with no borders and a heavy emphasis on cloud back to the applications or resources they need, and then pushing the edge of that cloud closer to the users in order to increase speed and efficiency and help with service delivery. So who are the vendors then that are going to emerge as key and influential once we sort of merge these old worlds of networking and security in the new world of cloud? And we'll talk about that a bit as well. Who should the buyers trust? All right, so that's enough of my babbling setup. Let's get right to the discussion. And again, write your questions down. I don't know if there's an ability right now to submit them, but when we get to the Q&A at the end, we'd love to take questions. So discussion one, how and why was 2020 dramatically changed in terms of cybersecurity as a result of the pandemic? So what we're going to talk about are what are the lasting impacts of the pandemic and this radical shift to working from home. But first, I want to give each panelist just a quick chance to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background. So we'll kick it off with TK. If you want to come off mute and give us a quick introduction.
Sure, thanks. TK Keanini, I'm the Chief Technology Officer for the Security Business Group here at Cisco. I came to Cisco through an acquisition, like many of the security products at Cisco. I was CTO for a company called Landcope that did the StealthWatch network analytics product. And then prior to that, I had a company called Encircle that did vulnerability management that sold to Tripwire in the early 2000s.
Excellent. And then next we have Gail Coury, Senior Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at F5. Gail?
Hi, hello everyone. Yes, I recently took this position, actually as of just March of this year. Prior to that, I've been at F5 for about 3 years as a general manager, overseeing one of our managed security services businesses called Silverline, which provides DDoS and WAF protection and in the cloud, a cloud-based service. And prior to that, I spent about 13 years at Oracle, running many large security functions for Oracle. I've been in the security space for most of my career. And so I'm happy to be here today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Gail. All right, next off of mute is Darren Anstee, CTO for security from NetScout. Darren?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Darren Anstee. I'm the CTO for security at NetScout. I came to NetScout as a part of their acquisition of the Danaher Communications business unit in 2015. And I was with Arbor Networks that was a part of that business unit. Arbor, as many of you may know, is best known for being the market-leading provider of DDoS detection and mitigation solutions to service providers all around the world. And we also do a lot of traffic monitoring and reporting product there. I've been at Arbor since 2003, so I've got a lot of experience in the DDoS space and the network monitoring space. Prior to that, I was in core routing and switching on the service provider side of things for about 10 years.
Great, and my eyes see Anstee, but my mouth just keeps saying Anstee. At some point, I'll get over that. And last but not least, we have Craig Connors, VP and CTO for Service Provider and Edge at VMware. Craig?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so in my role as CTO of Service Provider and Edge Business Unit at VMware, I cover our Edge strategy. So SD-WAN, which would have helped Jeff earlier today,
There you go.
Edge computing, as well as facilitating our service providers to deploy those solutions. I came to VMware through the acquisition of VeloCloud about 3.5 years ago, where I was the chief architect. I've been in the WAN space for about 15 years, led software development at Solari Networks, and then I was in Cisco Advanced Development prior to coming to VeloCloud.
Excellent. Thanks, Craig. Yeah, that would have been great if I had been deemed one of those critical executives who needed a SD-WAN and hardware appliance solution at home. But sadly, I am now on my personal hotspot. So cross your fingers. All righty. So let's go ahead and get started with the discussion here. So like I said, big picture, what we want to cover in this first section is what are the lasting impacts of the pandemic. Part of it is the radical shift to working from home. Part of it is all of the wonderful things that attackers dreamed up to launch at us during the pandemic. So let's start with Gail. What kind of new attacks did you guys see, or what kind of acceleration of existing attacks did you see as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, it's interesting. When the pandemic started, as I said, I was running this security services business. And I think what we saw initially, the attack surface really expanded overnight. So companies just went from having everyone in the office, as you said, Jeff, and everybody, overnight working from home. And that attack surface, we had, a number of organizations who were concerned about, having to expand their capacity for VPN, et cetera, and how to protect those environments and do it very, very quickly. I think we also saw an accelerated attacks for, web fraud. And when you think about it, and I'll just give you an example here in the US, when all of the relief money was actually distributed from the federal government into the state organizations, the states started seeing a huge amount of credential stuffing type of attacks. I know that we even at F5 had some of our employees who, actually had received notice that someone filed unemployment claims on their behalf, even though they were continuing to work through the pandemic. And so when we were realizing that this fraud was occurring, we went to some of these organizations and said, how can we help you first putting, WAF services in front of their environments, and then adding anti-bot, anti-fraud, credential stuffing protections in front of their environments to help them fend off this. The attackers actually, they went home as well, and they had lots of time on their hands. And I think they began to become very, very creative. And then I think what we saw last year, we have a threat intelligence organization at F5 Labs, and they just last month actually produced the latest report on application protection. And what there was a huge, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later in our conversation, but there was a huge increase in ransomware from 6% roughly in 2019 to over 30% in 2020. So a huge spike there, looking more again for monetary gain, and we've seen a lot of that in the news as recently, looking more for, not because of the data that they're after, but looking for the monetary gain that they can achieve from holding those companies hostage, if you will. And so I think all of those changes have been tremendously impactful to security, this expanded landscape that we have to protect, and the very, very fast deployment. I think the other piece that we saw was an acceleration in digital transformation. While you said that was one of the key areas that IT had been working on, we saw organizations move very, very quickly, because guess what? They needed to be able to interact digitally with their customers much more than they ever have. And so looking at all of that together, it's been really challenging as security professionals to address.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember writing a note in April of last year, and we had already seen some ransomware attacks aimed at hospitals in Eastern Europe that were already overloaded. They went home and took very little time dreaming up new ways to terrorize everyone. So the expansion of the surface is really one of the critical points here, the distribution of employees. So Craig, what do you think are the lasting impacts of this notion of the permanent remote workforce, or in some cases permanent hybrid workforces in places that had been, everyone all hands on deck prior to the pandemic? What do you think are the lasting impacts of that on cybersecurity?
Yeah, I mean, VMware is a great example because we're one of the companies that has gone to fully remote work for employees that choose to. I'm taking this call from Mexico, so I'm a great example.
Oh, wow.
So, I think I've said this before, and when everyone had to go home last March, like overnight, we made this shift, and it was really, heroics from IT teams to cobble together existing solutions to solve this remote connectivity challenge. But now that we've had time to assess that this is going to be the long-term approach, and this is going to stay for the future, now we're looking at what is the best way to secure those employees that are working remote. Because as Gail said, the attackers have had this time to see that it's going to be permanent and to shift their tactics and to try to take advantage of some of these things. And so we've also got to shift our tactics to protect against it. And that's where things like SASE and distributed security in the cloud and things that allow us to provide a similar consistent security experience, whether users are in the office or on the road, is going to be critical going forward, because we want to make it consistent, that experience consistent, whether you're in or out of the office.
Yeah, I think a lot of people probably took a look at their dependence on firewall capacity for SSL VPN concurrency, and maybe that's not the way forward long term for remote access. Does anybody else have anything that they want to add? The impact of the permanent remote workforce, or should we move on to the next question? All right, TK.
Yeah, I was just gonna comment, hats off to all the defenders out there that had to adjust to all this change. It's a much shorter list to talk about things that have stayed the same than all the things that have changed. So you still have to have strong identity. You still have to do vulnerability management and all the basics. But essentially what's different is, instead of the employees coming to a place and inheriting the security needed to go to them, right? And that's actually why I think, if something really punctuated a new architecture, the idea of zero trust now, while it was maybe academic prior or just popular within niches, I think it's a reality overall now that a zero trust architecture is the new way forward, and it actually fits the new way of doing business tomorrow.
Yeah, and was it just yesterday that the White House announced endorsement of zero trust architecture?
Yeah.
So that moves us into the next question, which is for you, TK. How did the pandemic affect what we defend? Right? What were the changes in topology? What parts of security became more important as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, the big adjustment really is that what we defend has changed. The objectives of cybersecurity remain the same, and so things like zero trust play a prominent role because it seems like overnight the internet now is the network, the cloud is the data center, and frankly identity is now the new perimeter. So that reality is it's just top to bottom, and in my lifetime, I've seen a lot of changes. I've gone from I've seen the mainframe to distributed systems. I've seen this is another one of that big change. So it's an exciting time.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so shifting gears a little bit, I'm going to throw this one at Darren, since NetScout has a unique vantage point into some of the largest and most active networks around the globe. How did the global network infrastructure hold up during the pandemic? We talked about major increases in traffic and obviously lots of new attacks.
Yeah.
Did the load and changes show any cracks in global internet infrastructure? How did DDoS patterns change?
So I think overall, and I think we all kind of know this from our experience last year, everything held up pretty well. We do have some unique perspectives on what's going on across the internet at NetScout. A lot of the ISPs out there around the world use our products for traffic monitoring and threat detection. And I think the ISPs did an outstanding job, really, in terms of making sure that everything was working as we'd expect. I mean, we saw peak traffic levels go up quite substantially, and those levels were maintained for longer periods every day. And that was the case everywhere, pretty much. If you look at the kinds of increases we were seeing, you're talking about a year's worth of growth roughly in about a 3 to 4 week period. So, very rapid growth in traffic levels, and of course, much faster in certain areas. So traffic to collaboration tools went up thousands of % in the first, few weeks of lockdown, as those lockdowns and, stay in place orders kind of spread around the world. And then, of course, we saw, huge growths around streaming services as well, as people, watch more videos at home, those kinds of things. So the fact that everything kind of kept working and working well really is a testament to how well engineered a lot of the ISP networks out there tend to be. That's kind of the positive side of it. What was less good news is that, as well as traffic growing very quickly, we also saw DDoS attacks grow very quickly last year. So we monitored over 10 million attacks across the internet through last year, up about 20% on 2019, with a peak in May, where we were seeing roughly about one attack every 3 seconds through our Atlas system. So a lot of activity going on out there. And many of those attacks were very complex. So we're not just talking about, simple packet bursts and things like that. We're talking about attacks that are made up of multiple parallel attack vectors that are being driven by attack tools and services that are very easy to find and very easy to use, but generate very sophisticated attacks targeting pretty much whatever you want. And we saw the range of attack targets change as well. So in fact, the range of attack targets pivoted more to the kinds of things that we were more reliant on last year. So things like streaming services, collaboration tools, e-commerce, healthcare providers, educational establishments offering distance learning, all of those kinds of targets really jumped up the rankings last year. So there were some big changes there as well. And of course, coming back to what was said right at the start of this, where we were talking about, financial motivations and things like that, we also saw a big jump in DDoS extortion last year with some big campaigns from people like Lazarus Bear Armada. That one's still ongoing, actually, and that's been targeting organizations all around the world over the last, 7 or 8 months now.
Yeah, and I would just add to that briefly. Darren's correct in the increase in DDoS attacks, but also moving up from the network layer to the application layer. Layer 7 DDoS became much more prominent as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think that's a good sort of natural transition to our next discussion topic. Since we're sort of in the thick of talking about threats already. Discussion 2 is how can CISOs combat the latest and most advanced threats? So we've already talked a little bit about DDoS, and this topic came up, so maybe I'll just let you continue, Gail. How has the commercialization of hacking affected security organizations' abilities to protect themselves? But what are the new wrinkles when you talk about the money involved in attacks, whether it's fraud or DDoS or ransomware or whatever?
As I said earlier, the attack surface we're trying to protect has significantly grown, which makes it the huge challenge for us. And then when we look at how hackers themselves have actually organized into businesses, and you can actually, as an individual, go buy a ransomware attack, for example. You don't even have to build it and understand it yourself, and their commercialization of hacking today. I mean, they have support services and, they want the customer experience to be very solid. So you wonder, okay, there is so much money to be made in this space. So from a CISO's perspective, and as I look at, my company and most companies today, we have a multi-cloud footprint. We have some SaaS services. We have some infrastructure services that we use in the cloud. We still have the on-prem. You still have everything that, you've had to do over time. Now you have this big, remote workforce. So how do you get your, hands all around that? And how do you have consistent policy, visibility to everything that's going around in your ecostructure, if you will? It is hugely challenging for any security professional. I think as we've talked about some of the, issues that you've brought up, and how do you manage the budget, and how do you, get this proper skills in place, and what do you do from a technology perspective? How can you have that consistency and still be across multiple clouds, as each of those clouds and service offerings that you're using has a different architecture and perhaps different services to be able to protect those environments. So I do think, the challenge has never been actually greater. And so all of the types of attacks we've just talked about, the increase in ransomware, the increase in fraud, in credential stuffing, and utilizing credentials that have come from previous attacks and just taking those and running them across all the different applications where you might have the attacker is looking for a financial gain. Protecting the web application itself. We've talked about zero trust. We've talked about identity. Think about all the ways that we have to be able to protect that infrastructure to ensure you have, a validated user coming from a validated device, connecting to a validated application over a secure session. And by the way, that application may be made up of, lots of microservices, and how are they connected to each other? What are we doing about API security? Because when we look at, where the attacks are going, they're going now at the API connections between those microservices. So it's not a pretty picture I paint.
Yeah, no, this is sounding kind of bleak, a little bit hopeless. Hopefully somebody has some light for us here. I know, TK, you had some thoughts on this as well, about how commercialization forces attackers to sort of follow the money. And then the question is, who are the new targets? So
they're trying to run a business the best they can. And so our job is to make it really expensive for them to run their business. You want to be the least attractive target. You want to be the highest cost to their margin. Cisco has one of the largest threat intel departments called Talos, and the eyes and ears of Talos is through DNS security, through email security. It's all the products in the portfolio, and so there's a sort of the tech once, protect everywhere kind of thing. The thing, again, coming back to the threat actor, it's really an innovation spiral that we face with these guys. We innovate and we make it harder on them. They innovate, they make it harder on us, and it's been like that for the past 30 plus years.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
If I could just add, we've talked about the pandemic and how that's caused things to shift. That's not the only transformational thing that's happening in the world. And one of the big things that's happened in the last few years is the emergence and the kind of meteoric rise of cryptocurrencies. And cryptocurrency has made monetization of hacking much easier than it was in the past. And that's incentivizing people to perform ransomware attacks and to get into this space. And so, we have to be innovative to defend against that, as TK and Gail were talking about.
It's not follow the money, it's follow the blockchain now.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so since we have you, Craig, so we've talked about borders disappearing and your user population as sort of existing everywhere and nowhere at once. Users aren't the only people that have been moving around. For as long as IT has been a thing, companies have owned their applications, and those applications typically live on desktops and laptops and servers in facilities that they own. Applications have become increasingly mobile. What are some of the threats associated with things like using SaaS and public cloud applications, which is, again, another massive change? And it's like we decided all at once that we were just going to, that like IT was boring. We had it sorted out. So let's just flip everything upside down and, make it hard again so nobody can go home at 5 o'clock anymore. But talk a little bit about how the shift towards SaaS and applications in the cloud has affected security.
Yeah, and I think Gail mentioned microservice-based applications. It's
yes.
not just to one place, they might be moving to many places, right? I might have different fragments of my application running in different places. So, TK mentioned zero trust moving from a niche thing to kind of a hard requirement earlier. And I think that's really critical here, because in the initial emergence of zero trust, we talked a lot about zero trust network access. How do I get a user that's outside of my trusted perimeter to an application that I could trust? But now we have zero trust application access on the other side, because now I'm not sure if I trust the application either, right? And so we have EDR looking at, is the application host safe? We have network threat analytics, evaluating the traffic that's going to that application. We're looking at the API calls, as Gail mentioned, to see, is this a normal exchange of data? So zero trust really has to happen every step of the way, from the device through the user authentication, all the way across the network, and then to the application, right down to the server the application's running on, if we really want to make sure that we have end-to-end security and we're delivering this in a safe way, now that users can be anywhere and applications can also be anywhere at the same time.
Yeah, and I think the general community understands zero trust to maybe be users and devices, but when we get into applications, microservices, and APIs, I'm not sure the world is on, or even code. Honestly, I'm not sure everybody's quite on board with the true scope of what zero trust could be, but we'll get there. Great. So Darren, I'm gonna bug you for a minute. So we've been talking about all these commercial threats, but we just came off of a year of sort of unprecedented activity around nation state attacks and state-sponsored threats and cybersecurity in a defense and military context. What are some of the interesting developments around that right now?
As you said, we've seen a lot of that going on over the last year, more than we have done in previous years. And even on the DDoS side of things, we've seen a lot of activity there. So, you've seen Ukraine, Belarus, Hong Kong, all of those in the media over the last year around various nation state events. And I think the big challenge here, with these kinds of threats, if I kind of follow on from what TK was talking about, is in this case, the attackers aren't motivated by money, and that really does change the way that they operate, and it changes the way that we have to defend ourselves. As TK mentioned, a lot of what we do is about making us a really expensive target so that the attackers go elsewhere. When you're talking about nation state, that isn't really going to work. They are very prepared to keep going until they succeed. It's their job after all. And they have a much broader range of tools available to them, all the way from, human intelligence resources to figure out, what you've bought, what you've deployed, how you've deployed it, what other projects you've got going on, right the way through to, being able to build out infrastructure and capability as they need it during the life cycle of an attack. They aren't constricted by what's available on day one. They can go and build new things as and when they want to. And they generally have more access to reconnaissance as well, so that when they're carrying out an attack, they can see how effective it was, which bits worked, which bits didn't work, what technologies were used to actually block them. Those kinds of things. So it's very different to defending against commercially motivated attacks. And these kinds of threats are a big concern as they become more prolific because of those things, because we have to defend in different ways. And they become even more concerning when you get into, away from DDoS and into other aspects of this, where you see more sophisticated attack vectors being leaked into the commercial threat sector because it helps to interfere with attribution. If there are lots of people using something that's very sophisticated, it's very difficult to figure out where the initial threat actually came from. So there are lots of aspects to this that make our lives much more difficult fundamentally, and as this becomes more prolific, it's a bigger problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are attacks that blur the lines. I mean, is shutting down an oil pipeline in the US a ransomware attack, or is it a geopolitical disruption? Same for disrupting the supply chain for meat processing in the States, and you can probably make similar cases across the world.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm being conscious of time here. I'm going to go ahead and move us to the final topic, which is to spend a few minutes talking about the cloud. So it should be no surprise that the number one threat to cybersecurity in the cloud at this point is probably misconfiguration. This is a problem that has dogged IT organizations since the beginning of time. So not shocking to see in the news that popping up as a key issue. So Gail, I want to start with you. Where should organizations start when it comes to understanding the vulnerability, the cracks in their cloud deployments, the risk and the threats that they're going to face? What are the first steps to securing infrastructure, applications, or data in the cloud?
Well, I think one of the first steps is to understand the services that you're purchasing from your provider and knowing where their responsibility ends for security and where your responsibility for security begins. Because I think there is a misconception when I was overseeing security at Oracle for Oracle's cloud, it was a very common thing for organizations to have these misconfigurations in their environment. We would isolate their environment, we would contact them, and they would say, oh, well, I thought you were providing security. And this is a misunderstanding. So you absolutely need to know what your responsibilities are. You're responsible for for the operating system. If you're on an infrastructure as a service and you're building an environment, you have to put the security in place. You need to do that monitoring. You need to make sure that your configurations are solid. So, and you know, all the way through the, you know, the middleware, through the databases, through, you know, your application. And so you need these layers of protection, and it's hard to do in the cloud because, again, what are you using as a service? So using, you know, security services that are cloud agnostic is something that I think is very valuable, because especially most organizations are multi-cloud. As I said, my organization is a multi-cloud, you know, organization. So how do we consistently protect? How do we consistently have visibility? So, you know, cloud security posture management, consistent, you know, WAF protection in front of those applications, consistent protection over your API security, consistent protection that you need, you know, for anti-fraud and anti-bot. These are things that, you know, I think if you think about it, each cloud provider may have offerings in this space, but they're different from one provider to the next. So how does your IT organization keep up with the skill sets required to really understand what the cloud providers are offering? So, you know, I think you have to step back and think about what is your overall, you know, strategy around cloud security, and then doing, you know, as I said, your best to have the visibility and consistency across your multi-cloud environments. Also, as you are, as I said earlier, infrastructure as a security, the cloud provider provides less. Platform, they provide a little bit more. SaaS, they provide more. So really understand what your role and responsibilities are, and knowing that you can't actually outsource the responsibility for security or compliance to anyone. As an organization, you own and are responsible for that. You just need to know, you know, who is covering certain components and contractually making sure that's clear.
And so let's drill into that multi-cloud question a little bit. I don't know if Craig, if you want to touch on this, or if anybody else wants to jump in. So where can you start to have consistent visibility in a multi-cloud deployment? What can you do to start to pull those so one cloud provider is hard enough. Now you multiply that by 2 or 3 and the differences in their offerings. What can an organization do there?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, cloud has changed cybersecurity because of the threats it's created. Cloud has also changed cybersecurity because of the advantages it provides, right? And so we have cloud-based security solutions as well to help us facilitate connecting the multiple clouds, using them securely, inlining firewalls or cloud web security technologies, depending on the destination application type you're going to. And so I think, you know, modern problems require modern solutions. We have cloud-based security solutions that are giving us a single point of ingress to the multiple clouds, giving us that point of visibility and control, and allowing us to make sure that we're able to apply a consistent security posture that we own, to Gail's point, to each of those different multi-cloud environments that we're accessing.
And Darren, is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think consistency is the key word, and everyone's using that. I mean, when it comes to visibility especially, we need that consistent picture of what's going on across the whole environment that we've got within a business, whether that's multi-cloud, whether that's data center, you know, across that whole environment, we need to be able to correlate what's going on so that we can identify the unusual, identify the new, identify those things that are more often indicative that something is actually going wrong. If we've got lots of different data sets, lots of different granularities of telemetry from different places, lots of different tools reporting information in different ways, it becomes very, very difficult to do that. And that's where we end up with, you know, gaps in our picture of what's happening that, you know, attackers slip through, and barriers for our security teams when it comes to kind of triage and investigation. And interestingly, if you look at what we've kind of seen in some of our customers over the last year, there's been a kind of a shift where in many cases they kind of adopted different tools from different cloud providers to start with as they kind of first got into cloud. But now what we've kind of seen is that they are moving towards kind of common platforms that they're layering on top of the different cloud operators, so that they can get consistency around risk management, around operational processes, those kinds of things. So we are seeing that kind of increase in interest in kind of third-party cloud-ready solutions that can be deployed across hybrid multi-cloud infrastructures. That's a big change that we're seeing now.
Gotcha. And TK, I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the reason why businesses are going cloud native is there's usually a part of their business. There's a business reason where they want to be elastic. If on Monday the entire internet shows up, they can handle it. And on Tuesday, if half of the internet shows up, they can handle it. And they don't pay for the entire internet, right? So there's an economics to cloud native that's incredibly attractive. What I'll say there is, with all of this sort of movement there's a much more operating at machine scale than at human scale. So then the question becomes, what is security at machine scale? And that's really the topic of sort of cloud native security, because even compute is orchestrated. You don't necessarily know where something is going to pick its runtime or when it's going to pick its runtime, but you do have the business intent in the model so that you can move from human scale to machine scale. So I think that's really the what keeps me optimistic about it is this culture that is bringing us cloud native compute is already focused on automation. Telemetry is a necessity. It's not like a luxury. So they actually have to have necessary and sufficient telemetry to actually do their job at machine scale, because the machines are doing it. And so that's really the transition, I think, is, security at machine scale for cloud has to be built in well into the early in the life cycle. And that's the whole shift left movement that we've been seeing.
Exactly. I totally agree with that. And more AI and machine learning to be able to react quickly to whatever type of attack may be coming into the environment, so that you're not dependent so much on the human factor to be able to respond to that. Because as you said, the compute, everything that's happening is at machine speed. So security has to be there as well.
Yeah, I'm surprised we got this far into the panel without talking about machine learning, but
I know, I'm proud. I'm proud, actually.
Techniques that the cloud allows, machine learning, remote browser isolation, things that we couldn't do with on-prem hardware, but we can do and catch threats on 0 day and catch threats at machine scale, like TK said. That's really, the power of the cloud for the good guys, as it were.
So it's part of the problem in terms of increasing complexity, but maybe it's also part of the solution when we talk about scale and automation. All right, so we're bumping up against the top of the hour here. I want to give each of you 30 seconds to give a quick wrap up. What you think the key audience takeaway should be. And let's switch it up. We'll go from the bottom to the top on my screen. So that means, Darren, you are going to go first here.
I think there's kind of two things that I would say. The first is that, I think the last year has really made it clear to us that, our infrastructures, the threat landscape are going to continue to change. And it's really the rate of change that's uncertain. And the organizations that have kind of coped best with what we've seen over the last year are the ones that have kind of had a solid foundation of consistent visibility across their platforms to start with, because we kind of use that visibility platform for everything in security, from detection through triage, through investigation. We use it to drive policy, classification functions, all of those things. So that core of consistent visibility, I would say, has really helped a lot of organizations. The second thing I would say, which is again pretty obvious, is that it's hugely important for every organization to really understand what's key to their business continuity and productivity, especially as things change, so that we can make sure that we have our defenses in the right place. We might have defenses, but are they really defending the right things as our traffic patterns change, as our user locations change, those kinds of things.
Excellent. All right, TK.
Yeah, I would just, same security tenant, which is, we're here for the business. So the idea is that the business models are changing, and so what we defend are changing, and we need to adapt accordingly. I think everybody will show that the companies that embrace change and do well with change are going to be able to last and be very resilient over these times, whether it be pandemic or not. I think that the pandemic has accelerated a lot of things that were on the fence. So is remote work okay? Well, it is now. Do I need to do zero trust? Well, that's the new way of doing security. So all of those things kind of fall in order.
Excellent. All right, Craig?
Yeah, I think, the pandemic's a big shift, sure, but also bring your own device is a big shift. IoT is a big shift. 5G is a big shift. Microservice-based applications are a big shift. The world is changing very fast. And to TK's point, bringing agility into your network so that you're ready to react quickly to the next change, because we don't know what it is. And if COVID taught us one thing, it taught us that things can change a lot faster than we ever thought they could, right? Like literally overnight. So, and it doesn't necessarily take a global pandemic. It could be the rise of a new attack vector or something else that will cause us to shift overnight. And whoever is most agile and most ready to make that shift, those are the folks that are going to be most successful.
Excellent. And finally, Gail?
I agree with all the comments that have been made here. It is a very unique time to be a security professional today. And I think that we do have to adapt and change along with the technologies that are changing. We have to thoroughly understand how technologies and DevOps and agile development and microservices work. And we need to look for solutions that can be consistent in making sure that security is, architected and designed into these solutions and as part of, the normal process of developing and delivering and operating and managing these solutions no matter where they live. So yeah, that's what I think as well.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so thank you guys for being on today. Thanks for a lively and spirited discussion. Hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. So again, thanks everybody for your time.